They say you don't hear the ground fall away when you're looking at the sky. That's how it was with Julian. I met him on a Tuesday that smelled of damp pavement and expensive espresso in downtown Chicago. I was a freelance illustrator, hunched over a sketchbook in a corner booth of a cafe that had more character than customers, the kind of place where the floorboards creaked like old memories and the air was always heavy with the comforting hum of a vintage espresso machine. I was struggling with the perspective of a window when he accidentally knocked my charcoal set off the table, sending a dozen shades of gray skittering across the tile like panicked insects. When he reached down to help me, our hands brushed. It was a brief, electric contact, and for a second, the city noise, the sirens, the tires on wet asphalt, the clinking of porcelain, just evaporated. He had these eyes, the color of a storm clearing over Lake Michigan, deep gray and startlingly observant. He didn't just apologize with a rehearsed line, he stayed. He bought me a fresh tea, sat across from me without being asked, and looked at my work with a focused intensity that made me feel both seen and exposed. He asked me what I was drawing not to be polite, but because he genuinely looked like he needed to know the source of the lines on the page. It's a blueprint of a house that doesn't exist, I told him, feeling a flush creep up my neck. Just a dream of somewhere quiet, where the walls don't feel like they're closing in. I've been sketching it for a year, but I can never quite find the right light for the windows. Julian looked at the messy, graphite-smudged lines and smiled, a slow, lopsided thing that made my heart do a nervous little somersault. Most people build with brick and mortar, he said softly, his voice a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the air between us. You build with light and shadow. I'm Julian, by the way. I build things too, but usually, my creations have to follow the rigid laws of physics, or they'd simply collapse under their own weight. He was a structural engineer, a man of logic and gravity, yet he spoke about bridges as if they were poetry written in steel. Our first few months were a blur of cinematic warmth. We wandered through Millennium Park at dusk, the beam reflecting our tangled silhouettes against a purple and orange sky. We spent nights in his industrial loft, the floor littered with my sketches and his complex schematics. We would talk until the sun bled through the massive windows, discussing everything from our favorite childhood haunts to our deepest, most irrational fears. He was my anchor. Whenever I'd get lost in the labyrinth of my own head, Julian would reach out, tuck a stray hair behind my ear, and pull me back to earth. I've got you, Clara, he'd whisper into the crook of my neck, his breath warm and steady. And I believed him. I felt invincible because he saw a version of me that was stronger, more vibrant than I ever felt alone. We fell in the way a house settles into its foundation, permanently, heavily, and with a profound sense of, finally. Our chemistry wasn't just physical, it was an emotional vulnerability I hadn't known was possible. I told him about the night my father disappeared when I was 10, leaving nothing but a half-finished cup of coffee and a void in our lives. He told me about the crushing weight of being the perfect son for a family that looked at his achievements but never quite looked at him. We were two halves of a blueprint finally being aligned, two structures leaning against each other for support. He loved the way I smelled of cedarwood and old paper, I loved the calloused roughness of his palms against my cheeks. Everything was saturated. The colors of the city were brighter, the lake air was crisper. We were building a world, and for a while, it was the most beautiful structure I had ever seen, a sanctuary built on a foundation of absolute, unwavering trust. It started with a tremor. Just a tiny, insignificant shake in my right hand while I was trying to ink a delicate commission for a children's book. I laughed it off at first, blaming it on too much caffeine or a lack of sleep. I thought it was just the stress of a deadline. But then came the fog, a thick, metaphorical mist that rolled into my mind without warning. It wasn't just simple forgetfulness, it was as if someone was slowly, systematically dimming the lights in the rooms of my consciousness, leaving me wandering in the dark of my own mind. I started losing my glow. The vibrant, talkative woman Julian had fallen for began to recede into a shell of herself. I was tired, not the kind of tired a long weekend or a good night's sleep fixes, but a bone-deep, soul-crushing exhaustion that made my limbs feel like they were cast in lead. I stopped wanting to go out. The neon lights of the city, which I used to find inspiring, now felt abrasive, even violent. The ambient noise of our neighborhood felt like a physical assault on my senses, making me wince at the sound of a closing door or a siren in the distance. Julian noticed every micro-change. Of course he did. He was a man trained to spot microscopic fractures in reinforced steel, and he saw the cracks forming in me long before I was willing to admit they existed. His gaze became increasingly worried, tracking the way I held a glass or the way I entered a room with hesitating steps. "Clara, you're shaking again," he said one evening, his voice tight with a fear he was desperately trying to mask. We were at our favorite Italian place, and I had dropped my fork for the third time, the metal clattering loudly against the porcelain plate. "I'm just stressed, Julian. The deadline is looming, and the publisher is breathing down my neck." "Just leave it alone," I snapped. The irritability was a new, ugly layer to my personality, a defense mechanism against the terrifying reality that I was losing control of my own body. The confusion between us grew like mold in a dark, damp basement. He would try to hold me, to offer the comfort that used to be my oxygen, and I would pull away because his touch felt like too much sensory input, like a live wire against my skin. He would ask me simple questions about my day, and I would just stare at him, the words trapped behind a wall of static in my brain. I saw the profound hurt in his eyes, the way he wondered if I was falling out of love, or if he had somehow failed the structure of us. He looked at me as if I were a puzzle he could no longer solve. The breaking point came on a gray, rainy Saturday. I tried to walk to the corner store just 2 blocks away, a route I had walked 1,000 times, and found myself standing on a street corner, sobbing uncontrollably because I couldn't remember which direction led back to our front door. The world had become a foreign, hostile map. Julian found me an hour later, drenched to the bone and shivering, my eyes vacant and terrified. When he brought me home, he tried to draw a warm bath for me, his movements gentle and frantic at the same time. But I pushed him away with a strength I didn't know I had, screaming that he was suffocating me, that his love felt like a cage. He stopped, his hands suspended in midair, his face pale and etched with a grief that looked like a decade of aging had occurred in a single moment. "I don't know who you are right now," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry wood. "And the most terrifying part is, I don't know how to find the woman I love in this ghost." That was the night the glow vanished completely. I looked in the bathroom mirror and didn't see Clara. I saw a hollowed-out version of a girl, a fading Polaroid left too long in the sun. Our home, once filled with laughter and the scent of expensive coffee, became a cold, clinical space. We weren't lovers anymore, we were a patient and a terrified, helpless witness to a slow-motion disappearance of an identity. As I descended further into the labyrinth of my mystery illness, with doctors throwing around terms like rare neuroinflammatory condition and atypical presentation, Julian began to transform. The man who once filled a room with his booming laugh and confident presence became a shadow. He didn't leave, he did the absolute opposite. He became a silent, hovering guardian, a ghost haunting the corners of our apartment, watching over me with a vigilance that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. He stopped going to the office entirely, taking a leave of absence that felt more like a permanent resignation from the world. He spent his days in a frantic, silent war. I would wake up at 3 a.m. to the flickering blue light of his laptop seeping under the bedroom door. He wasn't designing bridges or skyscrapers anymore, he was obsessively navigating medical journals, reading about clinical trials in Switzerland, and researching the molecular structure of obscure toxins. His desk was buried under mountains of printed articles, highlighted in a dozen different colors. His silence became his primary language. He stopped talking about his day, his feelings, or our future. He just acted. He cooked nutrient-dense meals I could barely taste. He carried me from the bed to the sofa when my legs refused to cooperate. He brushed my hair with a tenderness so profound it made me want to scream, because I felt like a broken doll instead of a woman. I felt I didn't deserve a love that was this sacrificial, one that demanded he disappear so that I could exist. I watched him break in slow motion. He lost weight, his cheekbones becoming sharp enough to cut. His eyes, once so bright and full of storm-gray life, became sunken and permanently rimmed with red. He was a man of logic, a man who believed every problem had a structural solution, and he was losing his grip on a world that no longer followed the rules. He would sit by my bed for hours in total darkness, holding my hand, his thumb tracing my knuckles in a rhythmic, desperate prayer that he never spoke aloud. One night, I caught him in the kitchen at midnight, staring at a shattered glass of water on the floor. He wasn't moving to clean it up. He was just standing there, his broad shoulders shaking, a silent, racking sob taking hold of his entire frame. It was the first time I saw the cracks in the anchor. "Julian," I croaked, my voice sounding like rust on a hinge. He didn't turn around, perhaps ashamed of his weakness. His back was as rigid as a steel beam. "I can't fix this, Clara," he said, his voice a jagged edge. "I've spent my whole career making sure things don't fall apart, making sure foundations are solid, and I can't keep you from falling through the floor. I build bridges across rivers, but I can't build a bridge to you through this fog." Yet, he didn't quit. That was the most agonizing part of his transformation. His love was a stubborn, painful thing. Even when I had a bad day and forgot his name for a terrifying, 3-hour stretch, he didn't panic. He just sat there, looked me in the eye, and introduced himself again with a heartbreakingly steady smile. "I'm Julian. I'm the guy who's going to get you back. Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere." He was fighting an invisible, microscopic enemy with every ounce of his being, even as he was being hollowed out from the inside. His silence spoke of a devotion that had crossed the line into a slow, deliberate martyrdom. He had become a different man, stark, focused, and utterly consumed by his mission. The turning point didn't come from a high-priced specialist or a breakthrough in a hospital lab. It came from Julian's descent into obsession. He had become a detective of my life, a forensic accountant of my movements. He had a map of the city on the wall with pins representing every place I had spent significant time in the 6 months before the first tremor. He eventually found the answer in the most mundane, forgotten place, the old, affordable studio space I had rented in an industrial district to save money for our future house. It was an emotional investigation that felt like a psychological thriller. Through public records and late-night site visits, Julian discovered that the building had been renovated with illegal, substandard materials that masked a massive, slow-seeping chemical leak from a neighboring industrial plant. The toxins had been vented directly into the studio's outdated air system. I hadn't been fading due to genetics or bad luck. I had been systematically poisoned by the negligence of a corporation that prioritized a bottom line over human lives. They had stolen my health to save a few dollars on filtration. I remember the day he told me. He came into our bedroom with a thick folder of documents, his eyes burning with a terrifying, cold clarity I had never seen before. The broken man who cried over spilled water was gone. In his place was a soldier ready for a siege. "It wasn't you, Clara," he said, kneeling by my chair and taking my cold hands in his. "It wasn't your mind giving up or your spirit breaking. They did this to you. They took your health, your art, your ability to remember your own home. They took us." The confrontation that followed was a blur of high-stakes legal threats and Julian's sheer, unadulterated rage. He didn't just want a settlement for the medical bills, he wanted them to see the human wreckage they had created. He forced a meeting with the building's board and brought my old sketches, the beautiful, intricate ones that spoke of a talented future, and placed them side by side with the shaky, incomprehensible scribbles I had produced recently. "This is what was taken," he told them, his voice vibrating with a power that made the room go silent. "You didn't just break a lease or violate a code. You broke a human being. You stole her light, her right to a future. And I will not stop until you feel at least a fraction of the weight we carry every single day." That realization changed everything. It gave the pain a name, and more importantly, it gave Julian a target. He chose to act with a ferocity that was almost frightening. He sold his shares in his engineering firm, the company he had built from nothing, to fund a highly specialized, experimental treatment program. It was a radical detoxification and neurological repair protocol that insurance deemed unproven. He was no longer just a caregiver, he was the architect of my survival. He navigated the dizzying bureaucracy of medicine and law with a ruthless, singular efficiency. Every decision he made was a heavy stone laid for a new foundation. He was dragging me back to the light by the sheer force of his will, but the cost was etched into the very marrow of his soul. He was trading his own peace, his own career, and his own future for the slim chance of getting mine back. He was rebuilding me, brick by agonizing brick. By the time the experimental treatment started to show its first signs of success, when the tremors in my hand finally eased and the fog in my mind began to lift like a morning mist, the Julian I had met in that cafe was gone forever. In his place was someone harder, older, and deeply, permanently scarred by the war he had waged on my behalf. Love had changed him in ways that were profoundly bittersweet. He was no longer the man who laughed at my bad jokes or spoke of bridges as if they were romantic poems. He was a man who had stared into the abyss for so long that the abyss had become a part of him. He had seen the absolute fragility of life, and it had robbed him of his lightness. There was a streak of gray in his hair that hadn't been there a year ago. His movements, once fluid and confident, were now calculated and tense, as if he was always waiting for the next disaster to strike, the next crack in the structure. I remember the first day I was able to pick up a charcoal pencil and draw a single, perfect, straight line. I looked up to see him watching me from the doorway, leaning against the frame. He didn't cheer, he didn't throw his arms around me in celebration. He just closed his eyes and leaned his forehead against the wood, a single, silent tear escaping his lashes. It wasn't a tear of simple joy, it was a tear of pure, exhausted relief. "You're back," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm here," I said, standing up on legs that still felt a bit like jelly. I walked over to him, intending to comfort him, but as I reached out, I realized the roles had completely shifted. I was the one who had to be the anchor now. He had spent so much of his spirit holding me up that he had forgotten how to stand on his own foundation. His hands were shaking now, a mirror of what mine had once been. He had become a man who lived in a state of permanent, high alert. He would check my breathing 3 times in the middle of the night. He would flinch if I dropped a spoon in the kitchen, the sound triggering a visceral memory of my first collapses. The trauma of nearly losing me had left a physical mark on his psyche, a kind of secondary poisoning. Love hadn't just lifted him, it had weathered him like a stone monument left out in a century of storms. We eventually moved to a new apartment, far away from the industrial districts and the poisonous memories of the studio. We would sit on our balcony, and I would watch him staring into the distance, his jaw tight and eyes searching for threats that were no longer there. He had sacrificed his career, his financial security, and his carefree spirit to save mine. It was a debt of love that I could never truly repay, and the weight of that realization was its own kind of heavy burden. We were survivors, yes, but we were also the casualties of our own absolute, unyielding devotion. We were like 2 buildings after an earthquake, still standing, but with facades covered in cracks. Today, I can draw again. My lines are different than they used to be, they are less whimsical, less focused on an imaginary light, and more grounded in a gritty, honest reality. I don't draw the blueprints of houses that don't exist anymore. I draw the one we actually live in, with its chipped paint, its stacks of medical receipts, and its quiet, shadowed corners. I see the beauty in the flaws now, because they are proof that we endured. Julian is in the kitchen right now, the steam from the kettle rising around him as he makes tea. He still moves with that careful, deliberate grace of a man who knows exactly how much weight a structure can carry. Sometimes, when he thinks I'm not looking, I catch him staring at my new sketches with a ghost of his old, lopsided smile, but the smile never quite reaches his eyes the way it used to. There is a permanent shadow there now. We are healing, but we are not fixed. You don't survive a year of poisoning and a year of emotional warfare and come out the same on the other side. We've learned that love isn't just the warmth of a first meeting or the excitement of shared dreams in a loft. That's just the scaffolding. Real love is the grit of the concrete. It's the silence when there are no words left to say. It's the terrifying willingness to be completely destroyed so that the person you love can be rebuilt. It's a beautiful, terrible, necessary exchange. Last night, we sat on the floor of our living room, surrounded by the remnants of our old life, my old sketches, his old bridge models. I looked at his hands. The calluses from his engineering days were gone, replaced by the softness of a man who had spent a year as a nurse, but the underlying strength was still there, visible in the way he held his mug. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked him softly, the question hanging in the air like a heavy curtain. "The cost of all this? Of who you had to become to save me? You lost so much of yourself along the way." He looked at me, and for a fleeting second, the storm-gray eyes were clear and bright, reflecting the man I had met in the cafe. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw with the same reverence he used to have. "Clara," he said, his voice steady and deep. "I'd burn the entire world down just to find you in the smoke. Every scar I have, every bit of gray in my hair. It's just a map of the road I took to get back to you. I wouldn't trade a single wound if it meant losing the person sitting in front of me now. These scars are just proof that we are real." It hit me then, the poetic, brutal truth of our existence. Love and pain aren't opposites, they aren't even different things. They are the same thread, woven so tightly into the fabric of a life that you cannot pull one without unraveling the other. Our story isn't a fairy tale with a happily ever after ending, it's an architecture of survival. It's a messy, beautiful, devastating structure of two people who refused to let the ground fall away, even when the sky was collapsing on them. We are like a kintsugi vase, shattered and put back together with gold, more valuable for having been broken. As the sun sets over the city, casting long, golden-orange shadows across our floor, I realize that the most beautiful things in this world aren't the ones that stay perfect and untouched. They are the ones that have been broken and mended, held together by a love that hurts just as much as it heals. Because in the end, love isn't where you go to escape the pain, it's the only place you go to make the pain finally mean something. Final line: we are not the people we were when we fell, but we are the people who learned that the most enduring structures are the ones built from the ruins of who we used to be.
Subscribe, like, and tell people about this love.